Oh, hi there. Welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. So this is my review of the 2026 Apple TV drama Cape Fear, starring Javier Bardem and Amy Adams. And I've tried to avoid unnecessary spoilers in this review, but it's actually quite hard to talk about the main themes and ideas in the show without giving away some stuff. So if you haven't watched it yet, it might just be best to click off and then come back here afterwards. So in terms of the cast and directors and so on, the series is created and showrun by Nick Antosca, who's best known for creating the horror series Channel Zero and also for co-creating the true crime series The Act. And the drama has a wide range of guest directors helming each episode, and it also has executive producers including Hollywood royalties such as Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg, amongst others. And it stars Javier Bardem as recently released convict Max Cady, Amy Adams and Patrick Wilson as husband and wife lawyer couple Anna and Tom Bowden, and then it's got a wide ensemble cast including CCH Pounder, Jamie Hector, Ron Perlman and Juliette Lewis. And the setup here is that we follow husband and wife lawyer couple Anna and Tom Bowden as their lives are upended following the release from prison of Max Cady after a 17-year prison sentence. And both Anna and Tom have previous history with Cady. So Anna was his defence lawyer at trial all those years ago, and Tom was the lead prosecutor in the case against him. And it was at that trial where the couple met and then got together, which of course then sets up the central premise of the drama, which is that Cady is certain that he's been set up by these two rich lawyers, and he then sets out to systematically target and destroy them. And very briefly, just in terms of the background to the Cape Fear world, this 2026 Apple TV version is now the third TV or movie adaptation of the 1957 novel The Executioners by John D. MacDonald. So there was a 1962 TV miniseries starring Robert Mitchum and Gregory Peck, and then more recently we've had the 1991 film directed by Martin Scorsese and starring Robert De Niro and Nick Nolte. And it's worth mentioning that it was the 1962 TV series that introduced the ending on the water in Cape Fear, hence the change of name from the novel. Because in the novel, the drama actually reaches a climax in the family home, and that's where it ends. And the central premise has always remained broadly the same across each of the book, the TV series and the movie. It's basically a cat and mouse chase between Max Cady and the Bowden family. But there's been some subtle differences in the setup over time. So for example, in the 1991 movie, it was actually Nick Nolte's character Sam Bowden who had previously represented Max Cady in his historical rape trial, and he then becomes the target of Cady. Whereas here it's Amy Adams' Anna Bowden who's Cady's prime target. And similarly, in the 1991 movie, the Bowdens have just one teenage daughter, Juliette Lewis, again, whereas here they've got two children. And of course, in that film, we didn't see any of Cady's family, which is another big change. And before I get into the main themes and ideas that stood out for me, I'm going to say straight off the bat that I really enjoyed this. You know, every week I was waiting for the next instalment, and I really thought it was a huge improvement on the 1991 movie, and it really breaks some new ground in the Cape Fear world. And I think what I liked most about this series was that from the outset it decided what it was and it just stuck to it throughout. And it's just a straight up psychological thriller. You know, of course, through the 10 episodes we do get some discussion about injustice and the sort of nature of the criminal justice system. But the focus across the series is the tension and the ratcheting up of the threat from Cady. So in the very first episode, you know, he's out of prison and he's already at the Bowden's house. And then the threat level every episode just ramps up from there. And we see that Cady's fueled by vengeance and he becomes almost like this arch manipulator. You know, there's literally nothing that's off the table. There's pets, children, you know, everything is in play. And everything he's experienced in life, and particularly in prison, he wants to turn back on the Bowdens tenfold. And he basically inserts himself into their life from episode 1. And over the course of the season, he just undoes everything that they understand and all the threads that keep them together. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the performances in just a minute, but interestingly, I think it's quite a low-key performance in many ways from Bardem. You know, other than the final episode when he finally lets loose, generally lacking in violence or overt signs of brutality. And what I really picked up on is that for the most part, he plays it like it's them living with a domestic abuser. You know, think about the constant gaslighting, the lying, the manipulation that we see. And for that reason, I don't think it's any coincidence that creator Nick Antosca flipped the gender roles in this series and made Amy Adams the protagonist, going head to head with Cady instead of a male lead. And personally, I really like that Antosca chose to do that because he evidently has a really deep understanding of that sort of total control and domination that domestic abusers, who are mostly men, seek to exert over their victims. So in this series, we see the way that Max Cady uses Anna's trauma against her, you know, in this case, her alcoholism, which is exactly what every abuser does. You know, it's like they can sniff out the people with troubled or abusive pasts, which then allows them to continue abusing with ease. And over the course of the season, we watch Cady destroy the Bowdens' relationships one by one, and he isolates Anna from her family, which again is classic domestic abuser behaviour. And he institutionalises each of the family members one by one. He makes them live his experience, and he destroys everything that Anna loves. And he even says to Anna at one point, this is what I wanted, for you to feel this, your family ripped apart, broken, caged. And I just thought the way that the tension ratcheted up, the nature of the escalation and how that was painted on screen, it was really cleverly done. And having worked with plenty of sociopaths and domestic abusers in my time, it was also really accurate in its portrayal. It's not always about overt violence, but more about control. And that's exactly what we see here across most of this season. And then I also like the fact that the series just made sense and that important ideas and themes were given space to breathe over the 10 episodes. So, in a TV series of 10 episodes, you've got much greater scope to explore different themes and ideas and then to develop your characters. And I really don't think I'm being unreasonable when I say that it should be the absolute bare minimum these days for a piece of popular culture, and particularly a season-long drama, to just make sense and hang together. But as with Scorsese's Cape Fear film, that's not always the case. So in the film, for example, there was absolutely no reason for them to be at Cape Fear or on the water at the end of the film. We didn't have any of Cady's backstory, and in my opinion there was just nothing holding the film together as a piece of work. Whereas here we have the shared experience of family and individual trauma for all the main characters that really knits the show together. So for Tom, we know that his brother killed himself when he was just a kid, and that he's effectively kept that a secret from the outside world for most of his life. And so as the viewer, we can imagine the guilt and shame that Tom might feel, and then how that might impact on his parenting, for example. And then what's good is that we see that play out on screen with his son Zach. So we see the self-harm, the self-loathing passing from one generation to the next. And then when you consider Anna, we learn about the neglect and emotionally abusive environment that she grew up in with her dad, and what that then did to her in adulthood, causing her to turn to alcoholism. And finally with Max, in this series, we learn about his abusive upbringing. We see the pain and humiliation that he was exposed to as a child. And then, of course, the question we're left with Max is whether he could ever turn out to be anything other than what he is as a result of that. And of course, that history and backstory then also gives meaning to what Cape Fear really is here. So in this series, I'm going to suggest that it's not just a place, but it's also a metaphor for suffering, for pain and for humiliation. It basically becomes the sort of central totem which represents each character's trauma. And then because we get that backstory for the main characters, it also helps us to understand their actions in the present. So it helps us see the shades of grey, and we're not limited to seeing people as crazy or a hillbilly, which is basically how people were portrayed in the Scorsese movie. And then very briefly, as well as that character backstory, here we also have themes of stuff like intergenerational trauma, how parents pass on their trauma, pain and suffering to their children. We see the impact of substance abuse, we see the impact of social media on teenagers and children. And I also like that the series explores ideas of justice and injustice and who has power and who gets to decide someone's fate within our society. And then there's also some interesting stuff about the sort of fortification and almost militarization of people's personal lives. So, here we see that there are these super duper defense systems at the house, but of course none of that's really any use when the violence is inside the family home. And then I also like the sort of occult or voodoo element to it all. That notion of Cady adopting a religion in prison and then speaking to some sort of pagan god throughout the series. But with all that said, I think what's really good is that all those themes and ideas that I've just mentioned are generally offered sort of secondary to the main event, which is the psychological tension. And I think that works really well. And then it sounds obvious, but having quality actors at your disposal can really improve the quality of a piece of work. Here, Javier Bardem, he absolutely elevates this beyond the typical run-of-the-mill psychological drama. And I really thought the performances were great across the board, but it's Javier Bardem who just stands out here. He's constantly walking that tightrope between familial and friendly, as he often is with the Bowden children, and then just chilling and angry. And of course, I've already spoken about Cady's backstory, which helps to bring him to life more. And that's important because what Bardem also does, and it's sort of imperceptible in some ways, but you start to see some elements of vulnerability in his performance. It's particularly true in scenes with his sister Crystal, but then it also comes out in other scenes. And we know that that's probably a result of his appalling upbringing. And so it almost engenders some sympathy in the viewer, which is probably not what you expect when you think of a character like Max Cady. And I really like the fact that all of the characters are painted on the screen as morally ambiguous. They all make mistakes and take the law into their own hands for their own reasons at different times. And as I just mentioned, we learn through the storytelling that there's no such thing as crazy or bad. There's just shades of grey in morality. And I think each of Javier Bardem, Amy Adams and Patrick Wilson put in great performances, which help the viewer see those shades of grey so that our feelings about each character then fluctuate over the course of the 10 episodes. And then finally, I really loved that this was very clearly a Cape Fear world. You know, we get the character names, the music, the kaleidoscopic and black and white camera shots, you know, the frequent nods and winks to the source material. But it's very clear that Nick Antosca's had license here to be very creative and to take it in interesting directions and basically to tell the story as he sees fit within that world. And of course, I've already talked about how the backstory for the characters elevates the drama, but it was also stuff like introducing the occult element, you know, introducing new characters such as Cady's half-sister and daughter, and then also slightly changing the Bowden family structure. And by doing all of that, and by developing the story as he sees fit, Antosca has sort of expanded the Cape Fear world and created a much more enjoyable and richer experience for the viewer. So overall, I thought it was a really welcome and entertaining new entry into the Cape Fear world. You know, I just really enjoyed watching it. It hangs together, you know, it's coherent, the themes make sense individually and as a whole, and the performances are brilliant, and Javier Bardem makes for a great Max Cady. So in my opinion, yeah, it's well worth a watch. And many thanks for watching. You know, please let me know in the comments, what did you like about the series? And of course, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.